It's 2:13 a.m. in Washington. And you're not asleep because sleep is for countries that don't sit on top of the global operating system. Your phone lights up with 3 alerts back to back, like someone is tapping a live wire. First, Riyadh and Washington announce a major civil nuclear cooperation milestone. A joint declaration. Negotiations done. Legal foundation set. The language is careful, polished, and deliberately vague, the kind of vague that hides a knife inside a velvet sleeve. Second, OPEC Plus quietly locks in compensation cuts through June 2026. No fireworks, no press conference drama. Just a reminder that oil supply is still politics by other means. The thermostat of the global economy is still being adjusted by a handful of men who understand that stability is a weapon. Third, the think tank ecosystem wakes up and starts shouting into the void. This isn't a breakup. It's a renegotiation. And for once, the think tanks are right. Because the Saudi-US relationship is not collapsing in a cinematic explosion. It's doing something far more dangerous. It's rewiring itself while the lights are still on. Less like an old marriage with shared bills and predictable routines, more like strategic roommates who still share a hallway while quietly maintaining separate dating lives. For decades, this alliance ran on a simple, brutal trade: security for stability and yes, oil. The United States provided the deterrent umbrella in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia provided the world with predictable energy flows and ebb. And Mali trade and Saud lasting color flows and regional coordination that kept the entire system from tipping into panic. Everyone called it a partnership, but it was always a contract. Sometimes written, often implied, always enforced by reality. Now, the incentives are shifting under both sides like sand under a foundation. Regional wars, energy transition, China's gravitational pull, new defense frameworks, and Saudi Arabia's identity crisis, so known as Vision 2030, where an oil kingdom tries to become something else without losing its core power. So in this documentary, we're going to break down why the Saudi-US alliance is recalibrating through 9 forces each with the mechanics, the history, the data logic, and the awkward reality behind the press statements. And yes, we'll stress test the comforting argument that nothing is changing against what's actually happening in the fine print. Because enduring is not the same as unchanged. Enduring can still mean colder, more conditional, more expensive. And that brings us to force number 1, the foundation beneath everything. The deal was always transactional. Now the transaction is changing. Picture a palace meeting room in Riyadh of air condition like it's storing frozen salmon for the apocalypse. On one side, Saudi officials with binders labeled Vision 2030, defense, energy. On the other, American officials with binders labeled non-proliferation, regional stability, and a silent page that reads, "Please don't make gas $7 again." Everyone smiles. Everyone says historic partnership. And everyone is privately asking the same question. What exactly are we exchanging now? Because here's the core truth people avoid. The US-Saudi alliance was never a fairy tale. It was never values. It was never friendship. It was always a high-functioning contract between 2 systems that needed each other for different reasons. The steelman version of the relationship still holds. Saudi Arabia still needs American military technology, training pipelines, intelligence integration, spare parts, and the credibility that comes from being under the umbrella of the world's most powerful navy. The United States still needs Gulf stability because oil is globally priced, and if oil spikes, American inflation spikes, and American elections start bleeding. The bargain endures because the structure still exists. But what's changing is the pricing model. How much each side is willing to pay and what counts as payment. A huge misunderstanding online is that a defense pact is like a Netflix subscription. Click agree, and now Riyadh is covered under Premium Plus. But in Washington, formal security guarantees are politically expensive. Anything that smells like a treaty-style guarantee triggers the immune system of Congress, especially after 2 decades of Middle East fatigue. So you get a negotiation dance that looks polite on camera and brutal in private. Saudi Arabia asks, "If we get hit, will you show up every time?" The US answers, "We will show up, depending on the day, Congress, and the mood of the electorate." That uncertainty isn't just awkward. It changes behavior. It pushes Riyadh to diversify relationships and build optionality, not because it wants to dump Washington, but because it can't afford a single point of failure. A kingdom that's trying to sell itself as a safe hub for investment cannot run its national security on maybe. Now zoom in on what recalibration looks like in practice. Instead of one grand bargain, you're seeing modular add-ons, itemized billing, structured packages. A relationship broken into compartments because compartments are easier to defend politically. Look at civil nuclear cooperation. It's framed as a milestone, but it's also a negotiation battlefield because in U.S. law, nuclear cooperation isn't a handshake. It's a legal architecture with hard constraints. The American side wants non-proliferation guardrails. Saudi Arabia wants strategic autonomy, energy diversification, and status. The declaration says momentum, but it also screams, this relationship now runs through legal frameworks, not vibes. Look at defense cooperation. Instead of vague, open-ended expectations, the relationship leans toward defined arrangements. Defined deliverables, defined language designed to survive a news cycle, a committee vote, and a presidential transition. And then there's oil the ghost in every room. People love to say the U.S. doesn't need Saudi oil anymore. It's a seductive line. It sounds modern, sounds like independence. But the truth is, even if America produces more, oil is a global thermostat. If prices spike, voters feel it. Corporations feel it. Central banks feel it. Saudi leverage is no longer we supply America. It's we influence the expectations that move the global market. And OPEC Plus with compensation, cuts, and discipline through mid-2026 signals that supply politics is still a contact sport. Saudi isn't just selling oil. Saudi is enforcing a market narrative. We are still the center of gravity. So what does Saudi do inside this new pricing model? It buys options, it builds optionality. It diversifies lanes, economic partners, diplomatic channels. Defense suppliers where feasible without pretending it can swap the U.S. security ecosystem overnight. Because military ecosystems are sticky. You don't just switch them like phone carriers. You don't migrate decades of training, maintenance, interoperability, and intelligence integration in a year. This is why recalibration is the correct word. Not rupture, not breakup, not betrayal. The United States recalibrates because it needs cost control and political sustainability. Fewer blank checks, more defined arrangements, more legal guardrails. Saudi Arabia recalibrates because it wants strategic autonomy without losing high-end deterrence and technology. Both sides are trying to keep the relationship functional in a world where the old assumptions are getting expensive. And yes, this is the part where the internet says, so they're still friends. Sure, but it's the kind of friendship where you split the bill and quietly send a Venmo request afterward. Every interaction has a receipt now. And that's only force number one. Because once you understand that the alliance is being repriced, the next question becomes unavoidable. What caused the repricing to accelerate so violently in the first place? In the next section, we're going to talk about the moment the Gulf learned security guarantees have fine print when the sky started throwing knives, and the alliance stopped feeling like an umbrella and started feeling like an insurance policy with deductibles. Force number 2 begins with a date that still lives in the nervous system of every Gulf policymaker because it proved something no one wanted to. Admit out loud, security guarantees have fine print. Imagine you're in eastern Saudi Arabia on September 14, 2019. You're not in a war zone. You're standing near the beating heart of the global oil system, mabcake and careware. Crude stops being a black liquid and becomes the fuel that keeps the world's habits alive. Then the sky starts throwing knives. Drones, cruise missiles. Precision strikes fast enough that your brain doesn't have time to debate politics. Within hours, roughly half of Saudi oil production is knocked offline briefly, but violently. The damage matters, yes. But the message matters more. If the most important oil infrastructure on Earth can be hit with that level of precision, then no economic system is truly secure. It's just temporarily untested. And here's where recalibration becomes structural. The debate people still have online is always the same. The U.S. still protects Saudi Arabia. Yes, there is still American military presence. There is still intelligence sharing. There is still air defense cooperation, weapon sales, training pipelines. Saudi defense ecosystems are deeply integrated with American and Western supply chains. The alliance did not disappear in a puff of smoke. But the shock exposed something deeper than whether the U.S. helps. It exposed ambiguity. Because the question isn't, does the U.S. care? The question is, what does care look like when you get hit immediately, decisively, and at scale? In Washington, the response is filtered through law. Politics, escalation risk, and the constant fear of being dragged into another Middle East war that becomes an endless drain. Multiple stakeholders, multiple veto points, multiple clocks ticking at different speeds. From Riyadh's perspective, that means the umbrella works, but it's not automatic. So Saudi leadership begins treating the U.S. deterrent umbrella less like a guaranteed shield and more like an insurance policy. And in insurance policies, there's always a deductible. That shifts psychological and strategic highs, the hinge of this entire story. It's why Force 2 accelerates Force 1. Once you've seen fine print, you stop building your life around assumptions. Now look at what happens next. Saudi doesn't just demand more protection, it changes how it manages risk. Yemen becomes a bleed you can't afford. At first, Yemen was framed as a decisive campaign, but over time, becomes something else. A constant launch platform for drones and missiles that don't just threaten territory, they threaten investor confidence. And when your national strategy is Vision 2030, turn the kingdom into a global investment and tourism. Of every successful strike is not just a security event, it's a reputational event. It raises the risk premium on everything you're building. It makes the future feel less bankable. So Saudi priorities evolve from defeat the Houthis to reduce the threat to Saudi territory and critical infrastructure. This is why you see the shift toward talks, ceasefire exploration, and de-escalation pathways even, if imperfect. It's not softness, it's cost control. It's actuarial logic. When defense is expensive and offense is cheap. The most rational strategy is to reduce the frequency of attacks, not just to intercept them. Then comes the moment that makes Washington's policy class do a double take. Saudi Arabia restores relations with Iran in 2023 through talks hosted in Beijing. People misread this as romance. It isn't. It's not friendship bracelets. It's not trust. It's a cold recognition that deterrence alone is incomplete in a region where proxies can hit you faster than formal diplomacy can react. Saudi isn't betting on magical peace. Saudi is buying time, reducing attack frequency where possible, lowering the odds of another Abqaiq-style shock while it tries to build a new economy under floodlights. And then the region adds another layer of chaos, maritime disruption, and the Red Sea crisis period. This matters because it exposes how quickly local conflict spills into global choke points, how a missile fired for political signaling becomes a supply chain shock that hits shipping, insurance, and perception. And perception is what investors actually buy. Saudi learns a brutal lesson here. Stability isn't only military, it's commercial. If your national plan has become a logistics hub, investment hub, tourism hub, then war next door isn't a news story. It's an attack on your economic model. So Force 2 does two things at once. It increases the demand for protection because threats are real and rising. It exposes the conditionality of protection because Washington's response is constrained. That combination forces Saudi to diversify options, de-escalate when possible, and push the alliance toward modular, itemized commitments rather than faith-based assumptions. And it forces Washington to narrow commitments, structure frameworks, and demand guardrails because in a democracy, blank checks are not politically renewable energy. Now, Force 3, because security shocks don't exist in a vacuum. They move through the bloodstream of the alliance, and that bloodstream is oil. Here's the paradox that eats every simplistic headline. Saudi Arabia is trying to become less dependent on oil, which means it needs oil money more than ever in the short and medium term to pay for the transition. And the United States, the country people love to claim, doesn't need Saudi oil anymore, still gets politically punched in the face by global oil prices, because oil is priced globally. If crude spikes in Dubai, it spikes in Dallas. You can produce more and still suffer the market. So no energy isn't less important. It's becoming a different kind of weapon, and a different kind of headache. The oil is fading, therefore the alliance should fade. Argument has logic, but it ignores mechanics. Saudi leverage is no longer "we ship you barrels." It's "we influence expectations, discipline supply, and manage the global thermostat through OPEC Plus in a market where small imbalances can swing prices fast." At the same time, Saudi's internal budget math makes oil feel less like power and more like pressure. Funding Vision 2030, megaprojects, industrial upgrading, tourism infrastructure, and the PIF machine requires capital. When oil prices dip, the stress isn't abstract. It hits timelines. It hits confidence. It hits the ability to keep the future on schedule. This is where recalibration becomes unavoidable. The alliance becomes less about a timeless bargain and more about a shared management problem. Because America needs oil stability politically, Saudi needs oil revenue fiscally, but both are operating in a new environment. U.S. production is structurally high. Saudi spending commitments are structurally heavy, and the world is trying to transition away from the very thing that funds the transition. That contradiction generates tension, and tension creates renegotiation. Now we need to address one of the internet's favorite fantasies: petrodollar collapse narrative, because it's an emotional story that feels true even when the mechanics don't match. Yes, some bilateral trades can be settled in other currencies. Yes, diversification is happening at the margins. But global currency dominance isn't decided by symbolism. It's decided by liquidity, convertibility, and the ability to park trillions in deep markets safely. So Saudi's realistic move isn't dump the dollar, it's increase options. Portfolio logic again, optionality, not revolution. And that is the theme of this whole recalibration. Both sides are building redundancy. Not because they're enemies, but because the world has become more multipolar and less predictable. So if Force 2 teaches Saudi the umbrella has fine print, and Force 3 teaches both sides that oil is still central, but now politically toxic and economically volatile, then Force 4 becomes inevitable. Because Saudi foreign policy is no longer just security management, it's capital management. It's fundraising at the scale of civilization. In the next section, we're going to enter the engine room of Vision 2030, the PIF. The gigaprojects, the investment logic can't explain how Saudi diplomacy increasingly behaves like investor relations with missiles in the background. Force number 4 begins not in a war room, but in a pitch deck. Imagine you're a global investor in London or New York. You open your inbox, and there's a glossy presentation from Saudi Arabia. It doesn't say oil kingdom. It says new economy. Neon skylines, AI-powered cities, logistics corridors, luxury tourism, sports leagues, industrial hubs. The future rendered in glass and ambition. Then, somewhere between the artificial islands and the gigaprojects, you notice the subtext. Please ignore the regional instability that could blow up the model. That tension, that gap between branding and geography is why Vision 2030 changed everything about the Saudi-US alliance. Because once your national project depends on attracting capital, technology, and talent at scale, foreign policy stops being purely geopolitical. It becomes investor relations at the macro level. The Steelman argument says Vision 2030 should push Saudi Arabia closer to the United States, not farther. And that's a serious argument. The U.S. remains the world's deepest capital market, the most powerful security provider, and a leader in advanced technology ecosystems. If you want credibility with global investors, alignment with Washington helps. True. But here's the twist people miss. Needing investment makes Saudi more demanding, not more dependent. Because now, the alliance isn't just about oil stability or security cooperation. It's about unlocking transformation. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, the PIF's the turbocharger of this transformation. Nearly $1 trillion in assets under management. Massive global investments. Massive domestic spending. It doesn't just invest. It builds. But building the future at that scale is financial engineering under pressure. Rising global rates, inflation, project delays, cost overruns, oil revenue volatility, dividend swings from Aramco. All of it feeds into the fiscal bloodstream of the transformation. And when oil prices dip or dividends fall, the stress is immediate. Funding megaprojects while managing fiscal discipline becomes a balancing act on a tightening rope. This is where recalibration becomes structural again. A missile hitting oil infrastructure isn't just a security incident anymore. It's an investor confidence event. A regional escalation isn't just geopolitics. It's a risk premium adjustment on every financing model in the kingdom. So Saudi foreign policy begins to prioritize stability in a way that looks almost corporate. Risk reduction, de-escalation channels, managed optics, investor reassurance. And that changes how Riyadh negotiates with Washington. The old model was simple. We anchor oil stability, you anchor security. The new model is layered. If we align with you, that alignment must accelerate transformation. It must deliver technology, legal frameworks, industrial partnerships, and credibility. It must be economically useful, not just strategically symbolic. That's why you see diplomatic packages that bundle defense, economics, and nuclear cooperation together. Saudi is effectively saying, if we're going to deepen this alliance, it must fuel the transformation machine. Now we enter force number 5, China and multipolarity. Picture a high-stakes dinner party. The United States is an old friend, slightly controlling. Sometimes lectures you about your choices, but when the room gets dangerous, it's the one who knows how to fight. China is a newer friend, calm, business-focused, rarely lectures, leaves every meeting with a memorandum of understanding. Saudi's strategy isn't to kick one guest out, to make both guests compete to be more useful. That's recalibration logic. The lazy narrative says Saudi is switching sides from Washington to Beijing. That collapses under inspection. China is Saudi's largest trading partner and a major energy buyer. It offers infrastructure, investment, and diplomatic convenience. It brokered the Saudi-Iran restoration of relations in 2023, a symbolic moment that looked like a shift in gravity. But trade partners are not security patrons. Alliances are about force projection, logistics, interoperability. Decades of training integration, intelligence fusion, and rapid deployment credibility. You cannot swap that architecture overnight. You cannot replace it with a trade surplus. Saudi can pivot economically faster than it can pivot militarily. Its defense ecosystem is deeply wired into Western systems or craft, missiles, maintenance, doctrine. That's not a light switch. So what is Saudi doing? It's buying options, it's hedging, it's building leverage. China expands economic and diplomatic options. The United States remains the keystone of the security stack. Hedging isn't betrayal, it's insurance against volatility. But hedging has a cost. When you diversify loudly, your old partner starts wondering if they're becoming optional. And in a recalibrating alliance, perception becomes policy. Washington asks, if we provide sensitive tech, where does it go? If we deepen integration, are we subsidizing a partner that might drift? Riyadh asks. If we rely too much on U.S. systems, can Washington restrict access during political disputes? Are we one American election away from a different policy environment? Both sides start building insurance against each other. Not because they're enemies, because multipolarity increases unpredictability. And then we hit force number 6, the most politically explosive element of recalibration. Israel, 4 months in 2023. Normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel was treated like an inevitable headline. The grand bargain, the regional architecture reset, the strategic masterpiece. The logic was seductive. Saudi normalizes with Israel. In exchange, it secures enhanced U.S. security commitments, advanced tech access, and potentially a civil nuclear pathway. Israel gains recognition from the region's heavyweight. The U.S. locks in a stronger pro-American regional bloc. It looked elegant. Then October happened. Gaza became politically radioactive. And suddenly normalization wasn't strategic genius, it was domestic liability. Saudi Arabia publicly hardened its position, tying normalization to Palestinian statehood conditions. That shift matters because once a condition is declared publicly, walking it back becomes politically expensive. Now normalization isn't just a bilateral decision, it's a triangular negotiation. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States with Palestinian statehood embedded in the geometry. Gaza increased the cost of normalization for Riyadh while increasing urgency in Washington. That triangle stalled. And when the grand bargain stalls, recalibration spreads. Instead of one massive diplomatic synthesis, the alliance fragments into smaller modules. Defense cooperation here, nuclear talks there, economic coordination elsewhere. The normalization package was supposed to be glue. When glue fails, you use screws. And screws are slower, more conditional, more visible. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When alliances operate quietly, they're easier to maintain. When they become headlines, when every move is judged as pro or anti-something, room for maneuver shrinks. So recalibration accelerates. Saudi continues pursuing stability for Vision 2030. It continues hedging diplomatically. It continues demanding clearer frameworks from Washington. And Washington, constrained by domestic politics and regional complexity, adapts to a slower, more conditional rhythm. The alliance doesn't collapse. It compartmentalizes. And now we move into force number 7, because even if Riyadh and the White House agree on something, there's a third actor that always shows up late and changes the plot: Congress. In the next section, we're going to step inside the American political machine and explain why U.S. domestic politics turned this alliance into a congressional chess match where even yes can mean yes. But with 400 pages of conditions, force number 7 begins with a whisper in a Washington hallway. Imagine you're a Saudi negotiator. You've done the meetings. You've heard the phrases: strategic partnership, shared interests, long-term cooperation. You've shaken hands under flags. The White House signals alignment. Then someone pulls you aside and says the sentence that defines modern American foreign policy. Cool. Now you need Congress. And suddenly you realize this alliance isn't a two-player game. It's a three-player game. The White House, Congress, and the American public. Mood which sends signals through elections like weather patterns that can flip overnight. This is one of the deepest drivers of recalibration. Because for anything truly consequential, formal defense commitments, advanced weapons transfers, civil nuclear cooperation, the executive branch is powerful, but not sovereign. Congress is not a spectator. It is the bouncer. The Steelman argument says presidents control foreign policy. They do. But major commitments, especially those resembling treaty-style guarantees, face political gravity. When discussions surface about something akin to a U.S.-Japan-style security framework, the language always includes constitutional processes. That phrase is code. It means there is no automatic war button. Saudi Arabia understands this, so it adapts. Instead of demanding NATO in the desert guarantees, it seeks structured cooperation frameworks that look strong enough to deter adversaries, but flexible enough to survive congressional scrutiny. This is recalibration in practice. Both sides try to design commitments that can survive domestic politics. Now, look at arms sales. Saudi Arabia has historically been one of the largest buyers of American defense equipment. But in recent years, arms transfers have become political flashpoints tied to Yemen, human rights debates, regional escalation fears. When arms sales become congressional battles, two recalibration effects happen. 1. Saudi seeks diversification. Not necessarily replacement, but reduction of vulnerability to U.S. political swings. 2. The U.S. adds conditions and friction, making security cooperation slower, more conditional, less automatic. The alliance becomes more procedural. And nowhere is this procedural transformation more visible than in nuclear cooperation. Under U.S. law, serious nuclear cooperation requires what's called a 123 agreement under the Atomic Energy Act. That's not symbolism. It's a legal gate. This framework governs safeguards, restrictions on enrichment or reprocessing, compliance architecture that survives changes in administration. It's designed to prevent proliferation. So when Riyadh and Washington discuss civil nuclear cooperation, they aren't just discussing energy. They're negotiating over guardrails. Saudi wants nuclear power to diversify its energy mix, free up oil for export, upgrade industrial capacity, and signal technological status. All reasonable goals for a state pursuing modernization. But enrichment is the minefield. Because enrichment technology is dual-use. The same fuel cycle capability that supports reactors can, at higher thresholds, create weapons-usable material. And in a region where Iran's nuclear trajectory remains a core anxiety, any shift in enrichment capability becomes geopolitically explosive. So Washington insists on guardrails. Riyadh insists on autonomy and fairness. Congress watches closely because nuclear technology is not just commercial, it's strategic. The result? The alliance advances into new territory, civil nuclear cooperation, but through layered legal architecture, not handshake diplomacy. They're building the house, but one room, the enrichment room, remains locked. Now, enter force number 8, defense technology. The modern Gulf security problem isn't tanks crossing borders. It's asymmetric precision harassment. A $20,000 drone with GPS and a bad attitude can force a $3 million interceptor to launch. Offense is cheap. Defense is expensive. That's not just military math. That's budget math. Saudi Arabia is trying to protect oil facilities, airports, tourism infrastructure, futuristic cities not fully built yet. Every strike risks economic confidence. High-end missile defense is not a gadget. It's an ecosystem, a radar integration, command and control networks, layered interceptors, training pipelines, intelligence fusion. This is where the U.S. still has a decisive edge, not just in hardware, but in integrated architectures. But here's the trap. The deeper Saudi integrates into U.S. systems, the harder it is to switch suppliers. The harder it is to switch, the more leverage Washington has. The more leverage Washington has, the more Riyadh wants alternatives. That's recalibration logic in one loop. Saudi's Vision 2030 includes building domestic defense industry capacity, only for jobs, but for autonomy. It seeks tech transfer, local production, diversified suppliers. Washington, meanwhile, becomes more cautious about advanced tech diffusion, especially when partners maintain deep economic ties with strategic competitors. So defense cooperation becomes negotiation-heavy, conditional, structured, not automatic. This is the alliance moving from always-on Wi-Fi to hotspot with data limits. Still connected, still powerful, but everyone watches the usage meter. Now we reach force number 9, the nuclear question in full. Civil nuclear cooperation is both convergence point and minefield. On the surface, it's energy diversification, baseload power, industrial upgrading, environmental strategy, prestige. Underneath, it's strategic status. From Riyadh's perspective, nuclear capability signals modernity, industrial sophistication, and long-term state capacity. It also creates optionality in a region where nuclear trajectories remain uncertain. From Washington's perspective, nuclear cooperation is a way to anchor Saudi development inside U.S.-led non-proliferation norms rather than leaving space for alternative suppliers with looser constraints. But enrichment remains the red line. If Saudi imports fuel and operates reactors under safeguards, anxiety remains manageable. If Saudi insists on domestic enrichment, the risk perception shifts dramatically. And here's the recalibration logic. Saudi wants capabilities and autonomy. The U.S. wants influence and constraints. Both want a deal, but only one that survives domestic politics and avoids triggering a regional arms race dynamic that transforms the alliance's structure. The old axis was oil plus security. The new axis is security plus technology, plus legal frameworks, plus strategic hedging. Less handshake, more compliance architecture. And that brings us to the final section. Because recalibration isn't chaos, it's adaptation. The question now is whether this new, itemized modular alliance is more durable or more brittle. In the final section, we'll tie all 9 forces together and explain what this means for the future and what concrete signals to watch to see whether recalibration deepens into strategic stability or fractures under the weight of its own complexity. So where does this leave us? If you zoom out past the headlines, past the outrage cycles, past the "is this the end?" narratives, the Saudi-US alliance is not collapsing. It's doing something more subtle. It's renegotiating the terms of survival in a different century. The original bargain was brutally simple: American security guarantees in exchange for Saudi oil stability. It was a clean axis, easy to understand, easy to explain. Oil flowed. The Gulf stayed contained. The system hummed. But systems evolve, and when they evolve, contracts must evolve with them. Now the alliance runs on multiple overlapping exchanges. Security cooperation, but more conditional. Energy market coordination, but less about barrels, more about expectations. Technology and investment partnerships, structured, legalistic, itemized. Nuclear cooperation with guardrails and political landmines. Diplomatic alignment modular, not sweeping. Hedging, because multipolarity punishes single dependence. Instead of one grand bargain, we now have a portfolio of smaller bargains. That's recalibration, not a breakup, not a romance. A contract getting rewritten because the old pricing model no longer matches reality. Let's tie the 9 forces together clearly. Force 1. The alliance was always transactional. Now it's itemized and conditional. Force 2. Security shocks like the 2019 strikes expose the fine print. Deterrence exists, but it is not automatic. Force 3. Oil still matters, but more as a global thermostat and fiscal bloodstream than as a simple U.S. dependency story. Force 4. Vision 2030 turned diplomacy into capital strategy. Stability equals investment flow. Force 5. China offers leverage and options, but not a substitute security architecture. Force 6. The Israel normalization package stalled under Gaza politics, pushing the alliance towards smaller, compartmentalized deals. Force 7. U.S. domestic politics means Congress and elections are always in the room. Every commitment has a legislative shadow. Force 8. Defense technology shifts the economics of war. Cheap drones, expensive interceptors, interoperability lock-in. Force 9. Nuclear cooperation is convergence and minefield at the same time. It can deepen alignment or create new stress if guardrails fail. Now, let's confront the 2 lazy narratives that refuse to die. Narrative A. Saudi dumped the U.S. for China. Too simple. Saudi is buying options, not switching camps. Hedging is not replacement. Military ecosystems don't migrate like trade flows. Narrative B. Nothing has changed. It's all media hype. Also, too simple. The alliance is changing in form, in bargaining behavior, in legal architecture, in political sensitivity. The vibes era is over. This is now a fine print alliance. The recalibration is real, and recalibration has consequences. It can make the alliance more durable because explicit frameworks survive leadership changes better than assumptions. But it can also make it more brittle. Because in a modular alliance, every module can be renegotiated. Every crisis triggers the question, are we still getting what we paid for? That question is stabilizing in normal times. It's destabilizing in moments of shock. So what should you actually watch, not emotionally, but mechanically? First, nuclear legal milestones. Do we see movement toward a formal 1-2-3 framework? What guardrails are included? Enrichment restrictions, fuel supply guarantees, oversight mechanisms. That will tell you whether nuclear cooperation becomes anchor or fault line. Second, defense packaging. Are new defense arrangements structured as defined modules with explicit conditions? Or do we see movement toward broader security commitments? The more itemized the language, the deeper the recalibration trend. Third, OPEC plus discipline through 2026. How strictly does Saudi enforce compensation cuts? That signals whether Riyadh still sees itself as global supply manager. How much it values price stability over short-term volume. Fourth, FDI and PIF pressure. If foreign direct investment remains below targets and PIF profitability fluctuates, Saudi will become even more stability. I'll stand about us to stand more insistent that the U.S. relationship delivers tangible economic value. Fifth, regional de-escalation behavior. Watch Yemen channels. Watch Iran management. Watch how aggressively Saudi leans into risk reduction versus projection. That tells you whether Vision 2030 continues to dominate foreign policy logic. Sixth, U.S. domestic cycles. Election years, congressional scrutiny, human rights debates, arms transfer reviews. In a democracy, foreign policy rides political weather systems. Riyadh calculates around that. Seventh, technology controls. If Washington tightens restrictions on sensitive tech transfers due to China-related concerns, expect friction. If guardrails are managed quietly, expect smoother recalibration. Here's the bigger philosophical takeaway. All alliances age. Some age poorly held together by nostalgia and inertia. Others adapt by turning emotional assumptions into explicit terms. The Saudi-US alliance is in that second category. It's It's moving from implicit trust to explicit frameworks, from grand narratives to modular bargaining, from oil-end umbrella simplicity to compliance architecture complexity. That doesn't mean it's weaker. It means it's modernizing under stress, and modernization is uncomfortable. The old model felt automatic. The new model feels negotiated. But negotiation is not weakness. It's realism. Because in a multipolar world where energy transitions, domestic politics, asymmetric warfare, and strategic competition collide, no alliance can survive on memory alone. It survives on updated terms. The recalibration isn't a headline. It's a process. Slow, layered, conditional. And if you're watching carefully, you'll notice something subtle. Both sides still need each other. They just no longer pretend it's unconditional. That's not the end of the alliance. That's the end of the illusion that alliances don't evolve. And in geopolitics, illusions are always the most expensive part. If you want the next deep dive, we can break down the Saudi nuclear pathway step by step, or dissect how OPEC Plus actually enforces discipline behind closed doors. Because in this series, we don't chase headlines. We follow incentives. We follow institutions. And we follow the numbers. See you in the next one.